Now, for biographers, there's been, and always will be, the problem of what can't be known, I suppose. One is reminded of the predicament of the elderly lawyer in Melville's Bartleby, who says of the eponymous scrivener, no materials exist for a full and satisfactory biography of this man. In the case of Hammett, his friends and acquaintances pointed again and again to his inscrutability. So as I sat there in the university library facing the same dilemma, it struck me suddenly that the real drama of the archive lay not with the elusive Hammett itself, but rather with the men hunting him down, beginning in the early 1970s. The often fraught correspondences laying bare their personalities, their fears, their frustrations, in a manner that was utterly at odds with Hammett's carefully buttoned-up self-presentation. Now, the early 1970s is significant as a date. Hammett died in 1961, with his reputation as a kind of literary heavyweight still up in the air. His novels had sold well, but not excessively well, and earned favourable and occasionally ecstatic reviews. And the second film, version of The Maltese Falcon, directed by John Huston, had put Hammett firmly on the map and earned grudging praise even from Hammett himself. But his failure to write another novel after the kind of dubiously kind of received Thin Man from 1934, had by the mid-1940s contributed to his kind of marginalisation. So his death in 1961 didn't produce kind of outpourings of kind of literary grief, but kind of more modest accounts of his achievements. In a brief obit piece for the Times, Julian Simons claimed that in Britain, Hammett had never been regarded or was highly regarded as Chandler. It was the following 10 years that saw interest in Hammett's life and work take off. The political tumult of the 1960s had shaken up the literary canon, and Hammett, as a kind of exemplar of working class, regional and urban fiction, was once again in vogue. The apparently radical impulses of the hard-boiled school, of which Hammett exemplified, also struck a chord with a new generation of readers, for whom Hammett's leftist politics was something again to be celebrated. Crime and detective fiction had found its way into university syllabi for the first time, and I suppose serious academic work, such as David Madden's tough guy writers of the 1930s, anointed this as a newly legitimate area of intellectual inquiry. The front page piece in the New York Times book review section for the Continental Op, 1974, a collection of Hammett short stories edited by Stephen Marcus, was testament to this kind of, this resurgence. The ever-vigilant Hellman noted the new mood. Quote, "It was a wonderful thing that it got the front page of the Times, which is rarely given." So with Hammett once again splashed out on the front pages, the race was suddenly on to bring Hammett to the world and the world to Hammett. And so the kind of flawed heroes of this story are not Hammett himself or Hellman, who became the executor of his estate, but the kind of freewheeling band of unauthorised Hammett hunters. It's the story of their generosity, their camaraderie, and ultimately their disappointments, as the object of their quest would perhaps prove as elusive as the statuette that made that Hammett immortalised. So our first player is someone called Bill Godschalk, Professor William Goldschalk of the Department of English at the University of Cincinnati. In February 1974, he would have been 36 years old and a professor for 7 years. A Shakespearean scholar, by training, an expert on the work of James Branch Cabell. Gottschalk, for reasons unknown, he died in 2015, had just signed a contract with Twain to write the first critical biography of Hammett. Now, we can say that he was absolutely committed to his new venture and approached it with a kind of industriousness bordering on the manic. With little or nothing known about Hammett's life, aside from what was in Bill Lonan's Hammett, a Casebook from 1968, Gottschalk set about writing to anyone and everyone who he could think of who might have known Hammett himself. I mean, this was not the era pre the internet, it was also the era pre-libraries. I mean, you couldn't go into a library and just research Hammett, because there wasn't any material known about him, in a sense. So Gottschalk wrote to Hammett's surviving family members, to his brother Thomas, who revealed they did not play together except in a house associated with different groups of people and shared few confidences. And then to his aunt, of his cousin Bernard T. Hammett, who replied the family did not wholly approve of Dashiell, his lifestyle and some of his leftist leanings, and tantalisingly that Hammett studied to become a priest, but did not follow this profession. I say tantalisingly because there was nothing to suggest any interest in religion in Hammett's work or what was known about him. And so for Gottschalk, this revelation would have been a significant breakthrough, if it could be corroborated. So he wrote back to the aunt for more information, but none was forthcoming. He also wrote to the St. Nicholas Catholic Church in St. Mary's, County Baltimore, where Hammett grew up, for confirmation that this had happened, but there was no records of Hammett ever having trained for the priesthood. With Hammett's friends and acquaintances, Gottschalk had more luck and was able to cobble together disparate accounts of the man, all nonetheless attesting to his private nature. William Glacken, who served with Hammett in the Aleutians in World War II, remembered him as follows: "I felt very closely to him eventually, almost as if he were a second father to me, and I always felt very keenly that he was a very private man," private in capital letters. Gottschalk wrote to the Pinkerton Detective Agency twice. He contacted the Montana History Society for any information about Hammett's time there. He wrote speculative letters to all of the Hammets listed in the Baltimore telephone directory, and he published open letters in the TLS, the Washington Post, and the Baltimore Sun, requesting that anyone who knew Hammett get in touch. It's interesting to see how this kind of biographical work might have been done, at this time. Gottschalk also wrote to any crime writers who may have known Hammett, including Rex Stout, who replied that he had only met Hammett twice, briefly and casually, Ross MacDonald, and James M. Kane, who claimed he had met Hammett only once at Edward G. Robinson's, described him as follows: "A wild-looking guy with white hair rushed up and grabbed my hand and said he was Dashiell Hammett, and that he made suitable narrations," this is Kane, "even though he'd only read a few pages of The Glass Key and didn't think that made, quote, much of a basis for friendship." So we can only imagine Gottschalk tearing open these replies with a sense of anticipation and frustration, the subject of his quest remaining elusively beyond his grasp. Undeterred, he contacted the son of Joseph T. Shaw, who edited Hammett in the Black Mask days, to no avail, to Hammett's publisher, Alfred Knopf, in order to straighten out Hammett's biography, which he described as a tangled skein indeed, and also to William Koshland, Knopf's long-term associate or assistant, who intimated that relations between Hammett and the Knopfs were strained not long after the publication of The Thin Man, perhaps because of Hammett's inability to come good on promises to write a new book. Now, Gottschalk was acutely aware of the kind of competition that was starting to emerge around his quest to write the first critical biography of Hammett. He knew of the competition when he took on the Twain edition and indicated in a letter to Ben Bradley at the Washington Post that, quote, "There is a good deal of interest in Hammett right now. Critics and scholars are busily writing about him." That was a tip-off from the San Francisco novelist and Hammett aficionado Joe Gores, with whom Gottschalk worked closely, that put Gottschalk onto Stephen Marcus, a Columbia professor who'd been approached by Lillian Hellman to write the official biography of Hammett. In 1974, Gores wrote, "I have received word by a circuitous route that a friend of La Hellman is working on a definitive Hammett book right now, a cat named Stephen Marcus. He's getting the cooperation of Knopf, etc., that you've been denied." Now, Gottschalk wrote to Marcus immediately, suggesting that they share information, and made passing reference to the delicacy of the situation and hence Balkan's diplomacy that might be needed to handle subsequent interactions. Now, one needs to understand, I suppose, that Gottschalk was very much the underdog, an interloper here. He was the kind of hick from Cincinnati. Marcus was a tenured professor at Columbia in New York and a friend of Hellman. The rumour you've heard is true. This is Marcus. I am in fact working on a biography of Hammett. I was asked to do so by Lillian Hellman, who, as you know, is the executor of the estate. I mean, it's not hard to read the what he's suggesting here into the tone of the letter. This, he explained, created certain differences, and while he would certainly like to trade information, there were also certain matters and documents which I could not possibly release, which equated to a kind of definitive no thank you. Now, Gottschalk's reply to Marcus's dismissive letter, hastily dispatched in July, did more than ruffle feathers, not least because he made reference to their shared Jewishness and to Marcus's orthodox approach to Hammett's biography. Your letter, this is Marcus, your letter represents the first occasion of my life when orthodoxy of any kind has been attributed to me. Adding it was nonsense to assume that his proximity to the estate would not give him absolute freedom in respect of his critical opinion, judgment, and so forth. Marcus, who would have been acutely aware of the competitive aspect of their shared enterprise, claimed he did not want to proceed any further until we have cleared up this matter about adversary parties and enemy camps. And he had a final admonishment for Gottschalk. This is no way for literary scholars or critics to conduct themselves, and I really think we owe something to the discipline we represent to behave in a different manner. So there's a kind of, ouch there for Gottschalk. Now, Joe Gause did his bit to stir the pot. Of Marcus, he opined to Gottschalk, Marcus does indeed sound like a shithead, but what the fuck aren't most people? A little later, in November, he told Gottschalk that he would unfavourably review the collection of the Continental Up short stories that Marcus had edited, and then included a damning review in a letter dated May 1975, with the acknowledgement that he was cutting his own throat, since Marcus will obviously have a chance to take a shot at Hammett, a novel, when it comes out. So Gause was writing a novel that featured Dashiell Hammett as a character in it. In the review, Gause describes Marcus's introduction as murky and pretentious, and castigates him for giving us little information and no insight on the San Francisco years so seminal to Hammett's writing, signing off with the verdict, high marks for Hammett in this collection and incomplete for editor Marcus. Now, I suppose at the root of this hostility was professional resentment at Marcus's perceived access to Hammett's papers and letters that they were effectively being shut out of. Now, it's here that Hellman enters our story. Gottschalk wrote her a polite letter in early February 1974, introducing himself and the project and asking if she could help me with certain facts, particularly whether Hammett had ever penned an unpublished memoir, and whether there were any Hammett's manuscript collections deposited in a public or private library. Hellman's secretary, Rita Wade, explained curtly that Hellman was away and would respond when she could. There's no evidence that he heard anything more from Hellman or Wade, but Hellman, prompted by this revival of interest in Hammett, which she and Hammett's daughters especially welcomed, but also worried about the kind of consequences of, took it upon herself to shore up the estate's defences. I suppose I need to be careful here not to paint Hellman as the villain of the piece. Her strategy of granting access to Marcus while keeping everyone else at bay was not out of line with the orthodoxy of running a literary estate. In subsequent letters, she repeated warnings to Hammett's daughters, Jo and Mary, not to speak or pass correspondences or other materials to anyone but Marcus. To Mary, she wrote in December 1975, I never said that the young men who called upon you about Dash was okay. The only person I said was okay was Stephen Marcus. It would be very unwise at this point for you to be quoted about your father. In April 1977, Hellman's tone turned increasingly dark. It seems to me that every week there is some reason for being cautious. Please do let me hear from you as soon as possible. This is my third letter, and I've heard no news from you. As an addendum to this note to Jo, Hellman concluded that there is also evidently a book being written by a man called William Gottschalk, from Cincinnati. Please follow the same rules with him. The first time Gottschalk's name crops up, albeit in misspelled form, in Hellman's correspondences to Hammett's daughters, and a full 3 years after he'd written to her. The intervening 3 years had taken their toll on Gottschalk, or perhaps his interest had moved on. Having blazed a trail in the early years of his pursuit of Hammett, Gottschalk's name becomes less and less prominent in the correspondences of his friends and adversaries as the decade wore on. We do know that his book for Twain was never completed, and that he returned to Cabell and Shakespeare for the rest of a successful academic career. Perhaps the efforts of toiling after a subject who would not reveal himself and fighting against a reluctant, unyielding estate eventually took its toll. Intriguingly, the same fate befell his academic sparring partner, Stephen Marcus, who likewise dropped his unauthorised biography for other projects, notably a set of essays on literature and society called Representations from 1975, which featured a chapter on Hammett. In April 1978, Hellman wrote to Joe, "Perhaps I told you before, I cannot remember, but the Stephen Marcus biography of your father has been called off. The real reason was that Marcus was delaying for so long that I was getting worried that I would have no control over anything." It tells you something about sort of, kind of Hellman as a sort of, as a character here, I guess. There followed 2 letters in May demanding that Joe contact Marcus for the safe return of any letters or photographs she'd given him, and being very firm and angry if necessary. And a 3rd letter in November in which she concludes, "Stephen Marcus was not a man of ill will. I think he's gone slightly nuts." Marcus, who passed away in 2018, aged 89, was replaced by Diane Johnson, who for Hellman, unlike Marcus, was understanding enough to give me the final approval of the facts of Hammett's life. But it's notable that both of these early efforts to produce the definitive Hammett biography ended in distinctively Hammettian failure. Now, Joe Gores is the most likeable figure in the archive, and tellingly no one has a bad word to say about him. In his correspondences, he comes across as a funny, garrulous, self-deprecating, and possessing a keen and perhaps unique insight into Hammett and his work. Certainly as a private investigator turned writer and a San Francisco native, he's the one who identifies most closely with the man they were seeking to unearth. Now, in many ways, Gores reveals himself to be a man of details. It's in the smaller details of Hammett's life and work that larger truths are revealed. As resourceful as you would expect a former private eye to be, Gores was undeterred by the manoeuvrings of Marcus and Hellman to limit access to Hammett's papers. This is Gores. I had hoped to be able to get into the Knott files through cloak and dagger operation, but word just came back that they've been sealed up at this cat's, i.e. Marcus's, requests. Gores wrote to Gottschalk in April 1974. Luckily, he added, in early 1975, "A good friend of mine at Knott is a man who's been there since Hammett's days, and he was able to dig up a few facts." Later in 1975, Gores was able to persuade a friend, Bill Targ, to go down into the safe's deposit vault in order to procure 2 Hammett letters to his editor at Knott concerning the revisions of the Dane Curse. These materials enabled Gores and Gottschalk between them to attribute an earlier completion date for the Maltese Falcon than was originally thought, sometime in 1928, while he was working on the corrections for the Dane Curse. A useful fact that helps to put to the sword the idea that Hammett wrote his most famous novel in the shadows, or virtually in the shadows, of the Wall Street crash of October 1929. Now, Gores' interest in Hammett relates mostly to his San Francisco years and the significance of place in his most famous novel set there, The Maltese Falcon. In May 1975, he would develop this theme, insisting that Hammett always used places he was personally familiar with in his stories. And he proceeds to try and clear up the mystery of why Hammett chose Burritt Alley, a half-block dead-end street above the Stockton Tunnel, for the famous scene where Bridget O'Shaughnessy entraps Sam Spade's partner and shoots him, when it does not lie in any direct route from her hotel and Floyd Thursby's hotel. Now, Gores' answer is far too convoluted for précis here, but it's convincing in its detail and says something important, as Gores argues, about the groundedness of Hammett's work in the physical environment where the stories are set. And more intriguingly, why he struggled as a writer when he gave up living in one place to lead a more nomadic existence with Hellman. In fact, Gores offers what, for me, is the most convincing explanation for Hammett's writer's block, something that emerges from a fraught 3-way communication between Gores, Hellman, and Francis Coppola, who was producing a movie about Hammett as a character based on Gores' novel. I suppose the central mystery for Hammett's biographers is why he stopped writing, or why he published no further novels after The Thin Man. So how was he able to produce 4 novels of such exceptional quality, Red Harvest, The Dane Curse, The Maltese Falcon and The Glass Key, in a period of perhaps 3 years, and then nothing else after The Thin Man? Now I suppose the standard answer is to blame either Hollywood, or his drinking, or indeed both, or to cite his relative financial comfort by the mid-1930s. For Gores, the reason lay in the chasm that opened up between Hammett's present and former lives, once he'd taken up with Hellman, and the assumptions about the worth or value of his detective stories in the more rarefied circles he moved subsequently. So this is a bit blurry, this letter, but I suppose it's heretical to say Gores wrote to Coppola in February 1976, but I doubt very much if Ms. Hellman ever understood the part of Hammett that made him a detective at all. I think there is an area of human experience completely out of her frame of reference. Gores went on to suggest, convincingly I think for me, the psychological dislocation that Hammett might have experienced once he was lifted out of the related pulps, the pulp environments, which had shaped him as writer and detective. This is Gores. I feel that after Hammett went to Hollywood, where he met Ms. Hellman, his creative output ceased, because in the milieu through which he was then moving, he was made to feel ashamed of the pulp stories out of which his style of writing grew. Gores concluded thus: once Hammett rejected the form in which he had learnt to write, and turned from a subject matter which he had grown from his own life and experiences, he no longer had anything left to say. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the sort of final figure of the kind of, the archives, a kind of quite prickly sort of, kind of professional writer and critic called Bill Nolan, and his kind of fraught, sometimes funny correspondences with kind of Gottschalk. To pass on to one postscript, I suppose. So I'll probably, only talk now for another sort of, kind of 5 or so minutes. So one postscript to this kind of tale of sort of literary scholarship as detective work. So while in the reading room at the Irwin Department of Rare Books, I came across a letter penned by Hellman to Joe almost 20 years after Hammett's death, and following the slow but rancorous breakdown of Hellman's relationship with Mary, that was Hammett's oldest daughter, whom she described as early as 1975 as your nutty sister, to the other sister, Jo, who was getting even nuttier. And I suppose a little context is required. In the months leading up to this letter, Hellman had complained to Jo about her sister's erratic behaviour and drunken telephone calls. She was as drunk as she could be the night she telephoned me. This is Hellman. What is the best way for me to reply to this? I would like to keep her as far away from me as I can. This is September the 22nd, 1980. Hellman received a reply from Mary, dated simply Thursday, in which Mary offered the following explanation and refutation. I'm sorry you thought I was drunk when I called you. Not so. The only drinking I do these days is a beer or two when my husband takes me to dinner, and that's a rarity. He is not a drinking man, and taking care of Mama for so many years has made me mighty sober. Just a complete lack of sleep for a long time. I know that makes my speech slurry. Now, the letter in question from Hellman to Jo is dated November the 25th, and it follows the death of Josephine Hammett, the mother and Hammett's first wife, a few days earlier. This is Hellman. I had many years ago decided that when your mother died, I would tell Mary that she was not your father's daughter, it began. I had believed that perhaps that would straighten her out in the obvious mess she was in, and for which your father was at least in part responsible without knowing it or understanding it. Now, the letter is not a new discovery. It's long been known about among Hammett scholars. It only came to light after the first round of biographies emerged in the kind of early 1980s. Now, most condemn Hellman's words as mean and vindictive, but her revelations here and where she lets it slip that the only person Hammett told, apart from her, was his analyst, and where she opines that whatever else one could say about the marriage of your father and mother, at least the ceremony was a great act of kindness on your father's part. it all raises, kind of intriguing questions, I think. Was it true for a start? If so, was it common knowledge within the family? It's difficult not to read the revelations back into the easy familiarity of Hammett's tone in his letters to Jo and the more formal tone he strikes with the slightly older Mary. And what impact did this have on Hammett? Hellman's casual reference to an analyst raises further questions. When and for how long was Hammett in therapy? Lehman's work mentions only Mary's deep love for her father and her worries as a young girl about his increasing alienation from the family. But Diane Johnson's biography is more revealing. Sometimes, she wrote, it seemed to Mary that Papa loved the baby, her sister Jo, more than he loved her. This is Johnson speculating about the early life as a family. Later, she's more explicit. His feelings for Mary were again strange and violent. She was both tough and fragile. He wanted to help her and at times kill her. Seemingly, Mary drank as heavily as Hammett, and things came to a head in 1946 during her visit to New York. This is Johnson. Sober, he couldn't remember things that had happened the night before. Passages with Mary, the import of her looks of hate, fear, defiance, love. He hated and loved his daughter. It was a kind of curse. Gale is even more explicit, or perhaps salacious. This is Gale. Hammett both punched and engaged in sexual dalliances with her. She was professionally diagnosed as masochistically fixated on her father. Now, these kind of insinuations are hard to reconcile with the much gentler, taciturn figure of the letters and of Lehman's biography. But the related notions that Hammett knew from the outset that Mary was not his, and married Josie, his first wife anyway, and hid this from everyone except Hellman and his analyst, does open up new grounds for assessing the man and his work. Lehman's claim that Hammett and Josie's casual flirtation soon developed into an intense love affair are contradicted by the Hellman-authorized Johnson biography, which claims he only pitied her. Either way, we can speculate about how knowing that Mary wasn't his from the outset might have affected Hammett and complicated relations with both his new wife and daughter. Much for an analyst to untangle, especially in light of Johnson's unwittingly prescient observation that the question of paternity is central to Hammett's work, and her subsequent claim that the central crime of two of his novels, The Glass Key and Red Harvest, is the murder of a son by his father. Now, speculation is something that the straight-down-the-line layman refuses to do. Here, as he says, truth is simply what happened. Facts are the important things. Research has taken precedence over invention or speculation. That's in his, kind of biography of Hammett. But it was Mary's plight, rather than her father's stoicism, or perhaps her rages, that remained, I suppose, with me most powerfully. Did she ever question her parentage, and how did this complicate her already complicated feelings for her father? How did she react to Hammett leaving a greater proportion of his estate to Jo, her sister? What were the effects of having to look after their mother, Josie, as she grew older and more senile? The most devastating, I suppose, haunting letter in the archive is undated and unsigned, typewritten on now crumpled paper, and presumably from Mary to Josie, her mother. Addressed simply to Mams, it opens up, "It's been such a long time, and you have been very tolerant. You've done everything you possibly can, but there is absolutely no hope. It isn't the drinking I speak of, rather something deeper. There's always been a feeling of despair. Mama has always been with me, even as a child." One can only imagine Mary haunched over her typewriter. "Everything has been a futile attempt at life. I'll never learn how to live in a normal way." This is Mary bearing her soul at her darkest, lowest point, with no equivalent revelation by or about Hammett. Mary is keen to absolve her mother and father from any responsibility. "Both you and Papa have been wonderful," she writes. But what to make of Mary's troubles and what they tell us about Hammett, especially in light of Hellman's revelations, are not at all clear. So that's really the sort of, the kind of end point. I mean, there's sort of, kind of more that I've sort of cut from this about sort of, those involved in the kind of pursuit for Hammett. And as I said, I'm not sort of quite sure sort of what this is at the moment, whether it, kind of, and it's certainly not a kind of, academic sort of paper, and it doesn't really sort of, kind of offer us a conceptual way of thinking about kind of archives and the usefulness of archives, or what can be found and what can't be found. So I'm sort of, kind of wondering what I do with it now, kind of, what, kind of, whether there's any sort of, kind of interest or place for sort of this kind of material, or whether it's just a set of interesting, sort of, kind of mildly interesting sort of, anecdotes for, kind of people who are interested in Hammett and no one else. So that's really sort of, kind of where I want to kind of finish. So probably talked about half an hour, so that's fine, that's enough. So thank you very much. So,
can I ask with a basic question?
Yes.
Now, you say Hellman was executor of the estate.
Yes.
What was her relationship with Dacia Hammett and the family?
Well, they were together. They were not married. They were together for 30 years. They were both incredibly sort of protective of one another. Kind of one can understand her suspicion and paranoia in light of how she was sort of targeted by the kind of, the sort of forces on the right, particularly the kind of House of Un-American activities. They never fell out, as such. They remained together. She, kind of had her difficulties with Hammett. They lived apart for many, many kind of, they didn't actually live together formally at any point, so they kind of had separate residences and kind of moved between, kind of Hollywood and New York and elsewhere. But she was kind of fiercely loyal to him as well, and sort of, one can understand why she decided to kind of run the estate as she did. And I was saying sort of, she kept everyone else at a distance, but, kind of, it made it almost impossible for biographers to do their work. And, kind of the first case that I didn't really have time to talk about, Bill Nolan, he wrote a case book, on Dashiell Hammett, but was not allowed to quote from any of the novels. So this is how different it was then as opposed to now. There was no chance of him being allowed to quote even from the novels. That was sort of that access was denied too. So, I don't know.
And is that copyright situation still sewn up?
No, I mean, I think now there's sort of, as with all kind of, academic work, there's the sense that sort of, kind of one can quote, for scholarly purposes, kind of from material without, kind of, having to kind of go, ask for copyright. I mean, I think it's slightly different with poetry, isn't it? So sort of, the estates, of Joyce and, kind of Yeats and, kind of Ted Hughes and others, kind of are more fiercely sort of protective of the work and charge for sort of, kind of scholarly works that quote from it. But in terms of sort of, kind of, the writers like Hammett, I mean, the work will be out of copyright anyway in 2025.
That's interesting.
So sort of 95 years after the first publication, of the novel, the works come out of copyright at that point.
It's weird because we've had a lot of movies inspired by the work of Dashiell Hammett since his death. I mean, like Brick, Miller's Crossing.
Yes,
These are movies that wouldn't exist without Dashiell Hammett. But there hasn't been a direct adaptation of one of his books since his death. Yeah. So I wondered if there was a situation where Howard or someone else. Pardon?
I think that happened.
Have there?
There's a movie of the Dane Curse.
Yeah, the Dane
Was
Curse,
there?
1979.
I wasn't aware of that. Was
Yeah.
that? Oh.
It was made for television.
Ah, cool. But
Yeah.
I just wondered if Howard was there.
And there's a Red Harvest as well.
Is that?
Well, there's Last Man
Well,
Standing, and there's Fistful of Dollars, I guess, is Red Harvest. But Yojimbo is Red Harvest, but I wasn't aware there was a direct.
Is there a sort of adaptation of, Red Harvest then?
Round about just after the Lehman book came out, I had a discussion with somebody who wrote about Dashiell Hammett, somebody that you know, in fact. And I said to him, I quoted Hellman on some aspect of Hammett's life and writing, and he said that anything that Lillian Hellman says about Hammett should be treated with a 10-foot barge pole that's been disinfected. And I said, why? What's the issue? And he said, well, she sought to protect him at all stages and he wasn't. I don't think he was referring just to her role as literary executor. He said she sought to protect him at all stages because he was a nasty piece of work. And I remember soon after that reading this quote, which you'll know very well. It was André Gide had championed him in France. You know the quotes, but I'll tell the other people. André Gide, was a leading novelist at the time, and he championed Hammett and said that his work was great art rather than pulp, and so on. And somebody told Dashiell Hammett at a party or something that this had happened. André Gide is supporting you. André Gide, by the way, was gay, and Hammett said, "I wish that fag would take me out of his mouth." And so I sort of put two and two together and thought, yeah, he must be like a pretty dreadful fellow.
Well, but it's interesting then, sort of what's happened in relation to the kind of archive and to sort of, kind of the work that Lehman has done, kind of, and the letters, because he's put together this kind of enormous volume of kind of, letters with the daughter. That's sort of, it's part of this sort of, this, the sanitizing of sort of Hammett, the kind of rehabilitation, why, kind of having gone through, 20 odd boxes, sort of, there's none of that, or, you read between the lines there in a sense. So part of the kind of, the work of the archive is to do exactly that, which means that sort of, if I, try and sort of publish this based on, kind of, the materials that I've gleaned from the archive, then Lehman, who's now on the board of the, Hammett estate, as is the granddaughter, so Jo Marshall Hammett's daughter, someone called Julie Rivette, they might turn around and say, no, you can't publish this, this is against, this, you're saying things that, kind of are not true, or, kind of, contradict, all these things, and I'll probably run into sort of, kind of, problems there for exactly that reason.
Well, I mean, this muddies the water slightly. The other thing I forgot to say is the person I was speaking to about this, I understand he was reasonably good friends with Stephen Marcus.
Right, okay.
So I wondered whether he got it from him.
Yeah, possibly.
I have a question and a comment. I'll make the comment first. I think this. Thank you for your talk, first of all. I think this what you've just mentioned about archives is fascinating. You sort of theorize archives as a objective repository of information that people can then glean from to create a picture of a person or of people. And this idea of it being sanitized, is an interesting one because it seems to undermine sort of the point of holding someone's papers in archive. But my question is much more broad and much more simple. Why Hammett for you? What? Obviously a fascinating person, but what motivated you to pitch up in South Carolina and go through a bunch of boxes? What is it about Hammett that moved you?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I suppose kind of sort of thinking about this question of sort of what happens when the kind of these novels that were so well known, kind of come out of copyright. So sort of kind of as said in 2025, the Maltese Falcon, published in 1930, comes out of copyright. And I thought sort of is there something that I could do kind of with that? Once the sort of copyright once the copyright sort of ceases, is there something sort of interesting sort of digitally I can do with it? Is there sort of would I be allowed to do that? What role does the estate have over sort of that material once it sort of emerges out of copyright? Is it fair game? So that was my sort of initial thought, and I thought, well, I'll go along to the archive to see whether there is anything new there, and sort of the more that I, so I got a bit of money from Queen's to go, and kind of had a bit of time, so I thought, why not? Now I suppose at no point did I go thinking that I would find out anything new, because it's sort of Lehman has he's written a lot about Hammett, and it's his archive effectively. So everything interesting has already been published. I think it's maybe slightly different if you just go to an archive that hasn't been curated by an academic. So, kind of say novelists, kind of give over all of their papers randomly to a library, and a kind of, sort of library curator doesn't really know what to do with them because they're not an academic or an expert. So they just sort of bung them out there, and then someone goes through them and sort of finds interesting things or not, as the case may be. But I think once the sort of archive has been kind of worked on by a scholar, an academic, and has published in many things over many years, you're not going to find anything interesting. And I sort of knew that already, so it was more the other thing I was interested in.
Well, you might not find anything new, but you can ask new questions
Yes.
of what you find.
Yes, true. I mean, I think that's a good point.
Just like you're looking at the material maybe in a way that is different from anybody else because you've got a different
Yeah.
interest, partly maybe as a creative writer yourself, I don't know, maybe because you're not so enthralled to Hellman perhaps or whatever, I don't know, but I mean, taking on board absolutely that lots of archives are pre-selected by the academic who curates them. You can still go into those boxes and find new purposes for the material, or ask different questions. So it seems to me.
I mean, I think, but that was almost the main point of their sort of presentation, was sort of, well, that sense that sort of, actually what was interesting was not Hammett, but sort of, these other, kind of these figures who were sort of, kind of, many of, I mean, I didn't know Gottschalk existed. I mean, he's not someone who ever comes up in sort of, kind of now in the kind of, sort of people writing about Hammett, even though he did a lot of the kind of early sort of digging work. But I knew, obviously, Marcus, I knew about Joe Gores, sort of, kind of Bill Nolan too. These were names, sort of, David Madden, these were names who sort of, kind of I came across when I first sort of, started to sort of, think about kind of detective fiction and Hammett particularly. And I suppose it was not as a novelist coming into it, it was an academic. It was like, that was the interest, seeing how academics corresponded, formed rivalries, cabals, sort of, kind of, how they shared information, how they didn't share information. I mean, it's really interesting, the correspondences between Gottschalk and Nolan, because Nolan was a professional writer who basically sort of, wanted to charge for his time by the hour, and that sort of really pissed off Gottschalk. But Gottschalk was a tenured academic who had secretaries to sort of do his photocopying and other things as well. So sort of, you could see how they would lock horns, over those kind of issues. And I thought, well, this is much more interesting, these petty squabbles, in some ways, than the kind of other thing that you might not know anything about.
I don't know if you. I mean, there's no reason why you would necessarily know that there's a precedent for this kind of metacritical observation of this process. Do you know Janet Malcolm's book from the 1980s called "In the Freud Archives"?
No.
It was a couple of New Yorker articles, I think, and it's about two. The reason I know about it is because I know the two guys involved. It's about two people who were similarly locked horns in respect of documents which were in the Freud archives, but which they found and they amplified in precisely the way that Paul described, and in such a way that it became a massive controversy and a battle between them. And I saw echoes of that in what you were describing. Perhaps it's perennial when there's more than one person working in a.
Well, it's often the case that sort of there's going to be sort of kind of two people work. I mean, as with the sort of the Henry James, kind of novels that came out, sort of one by David Lodge and one by Colm Turbin,
yeah.
And sort of kind of listening to or reading Lodge writing about that sort of kind of history is fascinating. It says so much about Lodge's own sort of anxieties about sort of kind of how his work is being perceived now as against to how it used to be perceived, his sort of fallen status perhaps in relation to kind of figures like Turbin, the fact that he regarded Turbin's kind of Henry James novel as being the one that sort of everyone talked about and no one talked about his own, and maybe that's just it. Sort of maybe we're just sort of we're people with thin skins and big egos.
And low stakes
Yeah.
as well.
Exactly.
I think it's also really interesting to be looking at why somebody isn't writing in
Yeah.
a literary archive or in literary biography, because as you say, it's such a condensed period when he wrote and then couldn't be bothered or whatever.
Mm.
And that is quite an interesting way of thinking about a writer.
Yeah.
But most of his life he wasn't writing books at all, or short stories.
I mean, he did write some things, and so there are kind of fragments of
Yeah.
sort of kind of novels and sense of engagement with script, but not really on any kind of detailed sort of level.
Did
But-
he work as a screenwriter then?
Yeah, but sort of not working on an original script himself. He was sort of kind of hired in to do work on things, but never did that in a kind of successful way in sort of Chandler's work. I mean, he might not have had that much involvement with things like the kind of Strangers on the Train or Double Indemnity or other things, but sort of he got sort of script credits on some of those kind of films.
That's an interesting. Chandler was like a self-publicist. He did all of these interviews, and he had like photos of himself taken with the pipe by the typewriter, and like that story you told indicates a man who wanted to remain mysterious. It's one of the fascinating things about Hammett, that he is so mysterious. So in a way, the lack of information about him contributes to his myth. I guess I'm inviting you to speculate there in a way that maybe we shouldn't. But
Well, his letters are pretty boring, though, has to be said. Or maybe the sort of the interesting bits have been cut out. I mean, he's quite full. I mean, he's he writes at length. There's no sort of attempt to just sort of be circumspect and sort of say very little. There's volumes of sort of the kind of stuff being there, but it's sort of not particularly revelatory, or sort of he's a man who is careful about what he sort of reveals to others in the kind of written form, which doesn't dispel any of the other stuff that Paul's talking about.
We learn a little bit about how to clean toilets from the prison letters, don't we?
Yeah.
But there must have been some people in contact with him, from the outside who have left traces during that period.
You'd think so.
I thought that would be soul searching.
This is why it's interesting, the time. So Hammett, the guys who are writing the first biographies are mid 1970s. So you think about the amount of time from the you're starting from the 1930s. So you're talking 40s, 50s, 60s, 30, 40 years. So lots and lots of time has elapsed then, and the ability to kind of trace and recover those people. I mean, by then anyone who knew Hammett would have been in their 70s probably, at the youngest, and so you're and some would have disappeared or died, and so by the time you start to look at the kind of his war years, that's a bit recent, a bit more recent. So there's sort of more information there, but he seemed pretty content in terms of the sort of serving in the Aleutians and doing his stuff and whatever.